On your screen right now is a region known as Outer Manchuria. Today, it lies entirely under Russian control and covers almost 386,000 square miles, or 1 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, the sheer size of Outer Manchuria meant that, if it were an independent country, its area would nearly equal that of Egypt and clearly exceed the area of Venezuela. But this land wasn't always Russian. For centuries, it was part of Greater Manchuria, territory under Chinese rule. Russia took it during what the Chinese later called their Century of Humiliation. And they did it without even going to war. They simply used pressure and power to force China's hand. So now the question is, does modern China, stronger and more confident than ever, want this territory back? Is there still tension between China and Russia over this lost land? Has there ever been a war fought over it? And what makes this region so important in the first place? To understand that, we need to go back to the 1600s, when Russia was expanding eastward across Siberia. As Russian soldiers and traders pushed toward the Pacific, they eventually reached the Amur River, territory claimed by China's Qing dynasty. The Qing saw this northeastern frontier as strategically vital, so when Russian settlements and forts started appearing near the river, armed clashes broke out. But instead of letting those skirmishes spiral into a prolonged conflict, both empires chose diplomacy. In 1689, they signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk, the first formal agreement between Russia and China. The treaty defined the border along the Argun River and the Stanovoy mountain range. Russia agreed to withdraw from the southern banks of the Amur, leaving the entire lower Amur region under Qing control. The deal also opened limited trade between the two powers. For nearly 2 centuries after that, the border remained relatively calm. Russia consolidated its hold over Siberia, while the Qing dynasty faced domestic revolts and growing pressure from European powers. By the mid-19th century, the tables had turned. Russia had become a rising global empire, even stretching across the Pacific into Alaska. Meanwhile, China's Qing dynasty was growing weaker. Corruption spread, uprisings broke out, and Western influence was rapidly expanding inside China. This was the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. It started with the First Opium War in 1839, when Britain defeated China and took control of Hong Kong and several major ports. In the years that followed, China was forced into signing a series of unequal treaties that further eroded its sovereignty. Then came the Second Opium War in 1856. Britain and France invaded China again, and by 1858, the Qing Empire was under immense pressure. Russia seized the moment. Without firing a single shot, it forced the Qing government to sign the Treaty of Aigun. Under this deal, China ceded all territory north of the Amur River and south of the Stanovoy Mountains to Russia, nearly 232,000 square miles of land. Only 2 years later, in 1860, China's troubles deepened. British and French troops reached Beijing, burned the royal palaces, and humiliated the Qing court. Once again, Russia stepped in, this time as a supposed mediator. But in reality, it used the chaos to extract even more land. The Treaty of Peking gave Russia control over the territory east of the Ussuri River, taking another 154,000 square miles from China. In just 2 years, China had lost about 386,000 square miles, or 1 million square kilometers of territory. This amount of land is roughly equal to the combined size of the U.S. states of Texas and Arizona, which together total approximately 383,000 square miles. This region was not only fertile and rich in resources, but it also gave Russia access to warm waters on the Pacific. Soon after, Russia founded the port city of Vladivostok, now its largest Pacific naval base, and the endpoint of the Trans-Siberian Railway that connects it to Moscow. Russia's takeover of Manchuria was part of a calculated grand strategy. In 1860, it gained a vast, fertile region directly connected to its mainland. Just 7 years later, in 1867, it sold off remote, icy Alaska to the United States, strengthening U.S. influence in the Pacific and subtly balancing against British power in what was then known as the Great Game. By the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was collapsing from within. Internal rebellions, corruption, and foreign invasions had left the empire in shambles. After its defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, China even lost territories to Japan. Then came World War II, when Japan occupied much of China and Manchuria. But while the war brought devastation, it also brought change. In 1911, the Qing dynasty finally fell, ending centuries of imperial rule by the Qing dynasty and over 2,000 years of China's dynastic tradition. The Republic of China was born, but it didn't bring stability. Japan's growing aggression weakened China further, and two major political forces began battling for control. The Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. This rivalry soon exploded into a full-blown civil war. When World War II ended, Japan's defeat left a power vacuum in East Asia. Soviet forces swept into northern China, defeated Japanese troops there, and handed their captured weapons to Mao's Communist Army. That changed everything. The Communists gained momentum, while Chiang's nationalist forces steadily lost ground. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers fled to Taiwan, where they continued to claim to be the legitimate government of all China. The Soviet Union quickly recognized Mao's new regime, seeing in it a fellow socialist ally that would strengthen the communist bloc against the capitalist West. The friendship was formalized in 1950 with the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. On paper, it looked like a partnership of equals. In reality, the Soviet Union saw itself as the senior partner, a view Mao quietly resented. But at that point, China needed Soviet technology and support, so Mao accepted the deal. Over time, the relationship soured. When Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took over and introduced the policy of peaceful coexistence, choosing diplomacy over direct confrontation with the West. Mao viewed this as a betrayal of communist ideals and accused Moscow of abandoning true revolution. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When Khrushchev backed down after U.S. pressure and agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba, Mao called it an act of cowardice. For him, the Soviets had surrendered to Washington's will and lost their claim to lead the global communist movement. This ideological clash came to be known as the Sino-Soviet split. As tensions rose, old border disputes resurfaced, especially over the Amur and Ussuri rivers. China argued that the boundary should run along the midpoint of the main navigable channels, the Thalweg principle. Russia disagreed, claiming the border lay along the Chinese banks of the rivers, effectively keeping all the islands for itself. While China peacefully settled borders with countries like Burma, Nepal, and even Pakistan, the Soviet case was different. In 1969, the dispute turned violent. On Zhenbao Island, the Chinese name, or Damansky Island, the Russian name, in the Ussuri River, Chinese troops launched a surprise attack on Soviet forces. The Soviets retaliated fiercely, and the ensuing fighting resulted in the deaths of dozens of soldiers on both sides. The world watched in shock as two nuclear powers clashed directly on the battlefield. The tension escalated to the point that Soviet leaders even considered a preemptive nuclear strike on China's nuclear facilities, though they ultimately held back. The crisis convinced Mao that China needed to balance Soviet power, and that opened the door for a diplomatic breakthrough with the United States. Washington had long recognized Taiwan as the real China, but that began to change in the early 1970s. With Pakistan quietly mediating between Beijing and Washington, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger made a secret trip to China in 1971. The following year, President Nixon's visit officially reset relations between the two nations. Later that same year, the United Nations voted to transfer China's seat and its Permanent Security Council position from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. That was a diplomatic triumph for Beijing. Meanwhile, border tensions with the Soviet Union dragged on through the 1970s. Tanks faced each other across the rivers, and both sides stationed hundreds of thousands of troops along the frontier. Minor clashes continued, but full-scale war was avoided. A turning point came after Mao's death in 1976, when Deng Xiaoping rose to power. Unlike Mao, Deng focused less on ideology and more on modernization and economic reform. He believed that China's long-term growth required stability and peace with its neighbors, including the Soviet Union. On the Soviet side, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the 1980s. Facing an expensive war in Afghanistan and a crumbling economy, he too wanted to ease tensions. Both leaders realized that old hostilities were holding their nations back. In 1989, Gorbachev visited Beijing, the first Soviet leader to do so in 3 decades, and talks on border demarcation formally began. Just before the Soviet Union collapsed, in 1991, both sides reached an agreement confirming most of the border in China's favor, following the main channel of the rivers. Some small islands remained disputed, but those were left for future talks. After the USSR's breakup, China signed new agreements with the newly independent Central Asian republics as well. Finally, in 2008, China and Russia signed the final border settlement, ending one of Asia's oldest territorial disputes for good. Both sides made small territorial adjustments, but the overall deal was seen as a balanced compromise. Today, the two countries call their partnership a no-limits friendship. They're founding members of BRICS, major energy trade partners, and often coordinate their positions on global platforms. It's quite a journey, from centuries of border wars and mistrust to one of the most strategically close partnerships in modern geopolitics. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating piece of history, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video to support our channel. And stay tuned for more deep dives into global stories that shaped our world.